Without truth, there can be no justice.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
Speak out. Ask those questions. Demand that truth.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 15 of Truth is Justice. Recently, there's been a subtle but definite change in the language used by Bob with respect to this case. The posturing has moved from consistent and regular references to justice for Jim to a very clear and deliberate message espousing Sandra's innocence and the focus being to achieve her acquittal. Whilst it's still offered that this also represents justice for Jim, it's apparent that this is no longer the main priority. The main priority now, in my opinion, based on everything I've heard and the way this case is being handled, is Sandra's acquittal. And I applaud Bob for that distinction, albeit recognising that it has taken a significant amount of time to publicly communicate that when it was clear that that was his position from the beginning. Now, it's a wholly important distinction to make because it absolutely changes the way Bob and his followers can approach the case and interpret the evidence. It means being able to move from a position of having to look at all the evidence equally to being able to take a defence team's perspective of the case. And what that means is you can choose to look the other way or take a different view with respect to some evidence, for example, the laptop login data. And you can take defence experts and witnesses at their word without question, and essentially no one can question you because it's no longer from a desire to fully understand the truth, it's a desire to achieve an outcome for the defence. It's important to remember to not mistake that approach as something which is without bias, and don't mistake it as being necessarily objective or focused on the truth. It's focused on a goal of acquittal, and as I've said, that may to some be consistent with the truth, but it doesn't mean that it is the truth. What I actually think we see here is exactly the same approach to that claim by Bob and others as being used by all of the people involved in Sandra's prosecution. By that I mean, it's taking a position with respect to the case without a complete and thorough appreciation of the evidence. In fact, many of you will recall that Bob went into this case with actually very little evidence available to him to review. Certainly not the case files or the transcripts or really anything of any real evidentiary value, other than what was passed on by Liz and other family members about the case. And Bob claims that others have tunnel vision and that they develop a theory and find the facts to fit that theory. It's very difficult to see anything other than that being exactly what Bob has done here. And I'm not just making those claims without basis. I think we have some very good examples of it. Firstly, the Reddit post by Liz. And for those that are not familiar, Liz, Jim and Sandra's daughter, made a number of posts on Reddit where she provides a very unique insight into the dynamics of the family and some of the challenges that were facing them in the period of time leading up to Jim's murder. The Reddit posts read as almost a diary of what was happening within the Melgar home, and the benefit of the Reddit structure is we know exactly when each of those posts were made. In the same way that a diary does, they show us not only Liz's perception of the events that were unfolding in the Melgar home at the time, but they give that insight without any reflection or consideration of the events that took place, as would occur now. So let me share a few of the comments Liz made in those Reddit posts, and you can decide for yourself whether they are relevant. On the 30th of September 2012, Liz made the following post. Now I'm not going to read the whole post out, it's very long, but I'll put the link up on the page associated with this episode on our website, and I encourage you to read that to get a full understanding of the context. Remember, all of these are available on Reddit, and they're also available on our website. So to quote Liz, "Last time I was visiting, a newly disfellowshipped came to visit me. one that had visited me several times before. I was told this time no disfellowship people are allowed to visit me at their home, as they are trying harder. This makes my blood boil." End quote. And then there's an edit to the original post with the following, and quoting Liz again. "So I spoke with my mother, tried to be very logical about the situation and made a few points about double standards and how I should be included in the no disfellowshipped people in the house rule. Turns out my mum is still the reasonable, laid-back woman I remember, and it's my dad that has made the rule change. My dad and I have never seen eye to eye and don't get along at all. We went for a year without speaking while living under the same roof, just because we are such different people. I can live with this. I'm going to spend the night with my friend and then come back to spend the rest of the time with my mum." End quote. And then in response to a reply to her post, Liz follows up with this comment. "You're absolutely right. I just don't know how to have a relationship with them when they behave this way. What about when I have kids? I'm scared of the brainwashing that they may attempt with my kids. I don't know. This religion has made my life unnecessarily difficult and painful. Thanks for the advice." Then on the 27th of February 2014, Liz replied to a post written by a Reddit user describing the difficulties they had dealing with their father, who was a devout Jehovah's Witness. Liz's words are, and to quote, "When I wrote to my dad about being an atheist and a few of my views, he replied with an email that was nearly word for word what your dad wrote in the PS section of his email. It's amazing to see how they are trained to respond to these things, and how they do in such a similar fashion. I hope things work out for you and your dad. Lots of luck." And the PS section referred to is as follows. "PS. Do not answer this to try and justify your thinking. I have cried enough. I will never deny Jehovah or his organisation. So if you try to talk me out of these things, I will just delete it without even reading it." Then, on the 7th of October 2014, Liz made a post asking for help from ex-Jehovah's Witnesses in finding material that could be used to present to Sandra to demonstrate to her that the Jehovah's Witnesses were a cult. In response to one particular piece of feedback that provides texts for Liz to present to Sandra, Liz makes the following comment, and to quote, "Thank you. This is exactly my plan, to go for the jugular." End quote. And why are these Reddit posts relevant to my claim that Bob's approach is no different than that which he recklessly slaps on others? Because, extraordinarily, Bob has not discussed these posts once. In fact, we haven't even been given any indication of whether he has even read through them at all. They definitely weren't acknowledged by Bob or Liz until they were raised by someone on the page. We do know that the very act of raising them on one of the Facebook pages led to the removal of many people who were interested in understanding further the meaning of the posts and the context in which they were written. So whether you believe in Sandra's guilt or her innocence, or whether you're undecided, material that provides an insight into the Melgar home and the dynamics of the family relationships has to be crucial information to have at hand. I mean, it's one thing to get opinions now on those issues, but this is 6 years later and views can change. Memories of the past can change, and they can also be influenced by events. Just take as an example Liz's different perception of the family dynamics now compared to back then. Now, it isn't like Bob doesn't see the family dynamics and the state of all the interrelationships as being important. Quite the opposite. In fact, Bob has talked many times about the nature of the relationships within the family, and based on the way it has been framed, it's suggested by Bob that Jim, Sandra and Liz had a family that was as close to a perfect family as you could possibly get. So what we see is Bob finding evidence that supports a theory that the family relationships and dynamic was close to perfect, whilst at the same time he is deliberately choosing to completely ignore evidence to the contrary, and worse, not even presenting that evidence to his listeners to consider. It is like it simply doesn't exist. Now, does that approach sound familiar to what we spoke about last week? It seems very similar to me. You might recall that Bob spoke with a family friend, Ms. Stephanie Davies, to seek confirmation, or personal experience I suppose you could say, at least that's how it was framed and delivered, of the comments about the family dynamics and relationships. And interestingly, Ms. Davies noted the fact that she reconnected with Liz through a Reddit community linked to ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, those that had been disfellowshipped for one reason or another. Importantly though, Ms. Davies made no mention of any of the comments made by Liz in that group that paint a very different picture of the way the family interacted. Had Bob been aware of the Reddit posts, he could have asked Ms. Davies about what her thoughts were on Liz's posts, or how the picture painted by Liz balances with her own views that the family was without issues. But instead, a unique and verifiable insight into the family from their only daughter in the period of time immediately leading up to the murder is wholly dismissed. Very much a case of look away, there's nothing to see here. Again, whether you are convinced of Sandra's guilt or her innocence, or whether you're undecided, is turning away from and entirely ignoring evidence like that at all consistent with wanting to discover the truth? No. It is only consistent with wanting to find evidence that fits with a given narrative, that the family was perfect, without any issues, and that it then follows that Sandra's conviction had been a wrongful one. It's exactly the same as what Bob claims that everyone else does. And secondly, take the bindings as another example, which was really what got me deeply involved in considering the case. Many people on the Facebook page were saying that it was impossible to do that in a way that was being described. The bent arms with candy cane wrapped bindings. I remember one post, and I truly felt sorry for the author who posted it. It was a screenshot of them attempting to self-apply the bindings, saying that they were going to release the video shortly. The attacks on that author were relentless. They were brutal and they were downright disgusting. There were memes, jokes, criticism. It was openly mocking the author of the post for various reasons, calling the author a whole range of different names, and then moving on to suggesting that the author didn't actually exist. Again, does that sound familiar? And it ended with finally resting on the view that the video itself didn't exist and that the claims were fake. Now really think about that behaviour and what it says about the so-called independent investigation and the desire to find the truth. Now, I was treated in a similar way. I recall sharing with a few people on both sides of the argument. There were staunch supporters of Sandra's innocence and those that believed in her guilt, that I might publish a video of me applying the self-binding. All round there were compliments and support for the experiment, even from those believing in Sandra's innocence. But that changed significantly once the video was put up. As many of you would know, the attacks on the legitimacy of the video came swiftly, and I took on board the criticism hidden in the attacks and made further videos, each building on the last. Even Bob challenged me to making a video with a particular type of knot, something I did that very day if my memory serves me correctly. But did it make a difference or change the way some people, specifically those absolutely and thoroughly convinced of Sandra's innocence, saw the matter of the bindings? No, it didn't. In the end, my fate, at least in terms of that particular Facebook page, was similar to that of the author that suggested they were going to post the video. There were memes put up about my efforts, attacks were relentless, nicknames for me were joked about and shared amongst the group. I was threatened via Messenger and via the page with supposed legal action. Now think about all of that and what it says about the supposed independent and unbiased investigation. Interestingly, quite a few people came out, including Bob, stating that the position the arms are in, being bent at the elbow and behind my back, would be a position that is all but impossible for many people to even get into, let alone to do so while self-applying the binding. But these same people, Bob included, see no problem with asserting that Herman, who suffers from a disability that impacted on his ability to even untie the knots and who, it was acknowledged at trial, is in even worse physical condition now, was able to demonstrate that at trial, how the arms were positioned. Herman held his arms behind his back and bent at the elbow. So on the one hand, it's argued that it is a position that is all but impossible for the vast majority of people to manoeuvre into, yet an older man with a physical disability is able to demonstrate the very same position, seemingly without difficulty. And third, the laptop logins. Now, like with the Reddit post, this has been almost completely hidden and the view has been to look away. But unlike the Reddit posts, we know this was information that was available at the time of the trial, and so we have the forensic examination by Mr. Devlin to refer to, and Mr. Devlin's testimony at trial. In fact, as many of you know, it is that testimony that is relied upon by many now to support the position that the laptop logins have no relevance. But let's look a little closer at exactly what we have there. Essentially, we have the answer by Mr. Devlin to 3 questions, but let's look at how that started. Mr. Devlin has asked the following question by Mr. Seacrest, and to quote, "Let's start with that, as far as use of the various computers. What did your analysis show in that regard?" End quote. And Mr. Devlin's response was, and to quote the first two sentences, quote, "I found 3 devices. Neither device had any significant activity, any significant user activity, between the hours of about 7:40 p.m. on December 22nd and December 23rd around 4 p.m. End quote. Now what's interesting about that statement? Well, imagine if Bob was considering this testimony from a state witness, and in relation to more than 2 items, that witness used the term neither. Generally, it's my experience in common use, if you're referring to more than 2 items, you wouldn't use the term neither. As in, if you were presented with 3 choices for dinner, you wouldn't generally say, "Neither of the choices appeals to me," in referring to all 3. You would probably say, "None of the choices appeals to me." And before people attack that, understand my point, that if this testimony was from a state witness and the intention was to pull it apart, there would be an absolute focus on that. And very briefly, I understand in historical literature the use of the word neither has different uses, Charles Dickens for example, but again, try and understand my point. So, the 3 questions that then are focused on are these. And Mr. Seacrest, and to quote, "So bottom line, based upon your experience, were you convinced that those devices were not in use by a human being during the hours you just mentioned?" End quote. Mr. Devlin's answer, and to quote him, "Correct." End quote. And the second question from Ms. Barnett, and to quote, "And also, as to this time frame of December 22nd from 7:40 p.m. to December 23rd, 4 p.m, you said there was no computer usage, right?" End quote. And Mr. Devlin answered, and to quote, "There was no user usage." End quote. And then Ms. Barnett, and to quote, "And I'm not really interested in that. I think you're testifying that no one logged on or off the computer during that time. Is that right?" End quote. Mr. Devlin answered, and to quote him, "Correct." End quote. You may wonder how that is consistent with my assertion that Mr. Devlin would not claim that the failed password attempt and successful user login is a system event without any user interaction. The answer is, it isn't. If Mr. Devlin was definitely referring to the 3 computers when making that statement, so by that I mean the reference to neither computer was referring to the 3 computers, not just to 2 of them, excluding the gateway laptop, then the possibilities I see available are Mr. Devlin made a genuine mistake in providing that answer, or he was genuinely confused by the question. The only one who could provide an answer to that, obviously, is Mr. Devlin. Are the answers to those 3 questions sufficient to essentially disregard the forensic examination by Mr. Devlin? In my view, definitely not. And I'll get into more discussions about the forensic examination later in this episode. The testimony by Mr. Devlin may potentially help you interpret the report, or, as has been done with others that Bob is closely associated with the prosecution side of the case, you could simply say that the testimony was wrong, or misleading, or part of an attempt to twist the evidence in Sandra's favour. If you are shaking your head at that, think about how often that has been claimed to apply in reverse. So a conspiracy against Sandra, over and over again, with everyone from the first responder, to the members of the grand jury, to the judge, to the transcriptionist. Very, very few people have been safe from claims of being involved in the conspiracy. I'm not for one moment suggesting that is the case with Mr. Devlin. As I highlighted last week, Mr. Devlin is a professional, and obviously someone who is highly skilled at his chosen profession. All I am doing is highlighting the distinct difference in the way different experts and individuals in this case have been handled by Bob. As I said last week, elements of that forensic examination provide the only specific, time-stamped evidence of events within the Melgar home that evening. Irrespective of whether you are convinced of Sandra's innocence, or convinced of her guilt, or you remain undecided, surely that information is absolutely crucial to understanding the truth. Surely it is vital to understanding the events of that evening. Under what circumstances would it not even warrant a closer look? Well, like the Reddit post, the consideration of it has been noticeably absent by Bob and others, and that, in my opinion, once again, is exactly the same as what Bob suggests others have done. There are other elements that demonstrate this point, but hopefully you get what I'm trying to say. To turn away from evidence, especially when it absolutely contradicts the narrative and the story that Bob and others are trying to offer up, as is the case with the Reddit posts and the laptop logins, is not at all helping them to get any closer to the truth. It is only helping to further that narrative without interruption or challenge, and demonstrating how incredibly easy it is to claim others have tunnel vision and a singular focus, when in reality that is exactly what Bob and others are doing. Exactly what they are doing. In my view, some people have missed one of the points I was trying to make with last week's episode on the logins. Many of you will have noticed such a massive difference in the way this IT data has been handled by Bob and those convinced of Sandra's innocence compared to other elements of the case. Elements that were perhaps initially viewed as being more important in her prosecution and less troublesome for Sandra in the future. Almost exclusively, these matters have focused on me and Truth is Justice, and requested that I prove what I am saying. Obviously here they are asking for proof beyond the forensic examination. Contrast that with the way other evidence has been handled in this case, the way other individuals have been handled, like Mr. Carpenter, like Ms. Rossi, like Ms. Martinez, where not only has their testimony been mocked and brutally, recklessly and wholly irresponsibly taken apart, word for word, but there's been almost no recognition of their experience, their qualifications, or the standing they have in their respective professional communities. Everyone, from Bob to somewhat anonymous Facebook posters on pages associated with his show, have become experts on the topics covered by these individuals. They challenge the crime scene analysis because in some cases they've watched some TV shows. They challenge the blood pattern analysis work because they own a textbook on the subject. They challenge how a policewoman can interpret something she witnessed firsthand by analysing the transcripts and reports and pulling apart every word and every reference made. But what we have seen with the digital forensic analysis stands out from those other individuals. It absolutely dramatically stands out. We've seen no attacks, no dissection of every word, no questioning the data or interpretation of that data. Just a complete respect for the skills, experience and qualifications of the expert witness, Mr. Devlin. In fact, when people have tried to speak up about the report, when people have tried to question aspects of it or give their opinion in some of the groups associated with Bob's show, they've been attacked, with some people even demanding that they either show that they have professional digital forensic credentials or they stop talking as the matter is too complex. Are they saying that it's more complex than blood pattern analysis or more complex than crime scene analysis or DNA analysis or the analysis of medical conditions or the study of memory? Now, all of those are topics which are very readily analysed by many of those same people entirely without dispute. The last week has seen the rehashing of various other attacks on Truth is Justice and myself, and very little, almost zero discussion of the actual facts. We've heard how people with claimed extensive experience in the radio industry believe our sound quality and our audio editing is bad, that I'm a thoroughly poor presenter, and that by extension our podcast, this podcast, is of zero value to those wanting to get to the truth of the case. As I've said time and time again, I really couldn't care less what the opinions are with respect to the quality of our sound editing. And when we start focusing our podcast on the topic of audio editing tips and tricks and how to break into radio, rather than on the facts of a murder case, I'll perhaps start to take a little bit more time to focus on it. Applying this argument to us, it's not dissimilar to criticising and disregarding a tip phoned in by a member of the public because the phone reception of the call was poor, As in, how could the tip possibly be of any use to the case? Did you hear the terrible audio quality? Now, Adam's identification of the login times as representing something to further consider resulted in what, really? Attacks on truth is justice and turning away. With all that said, I'm reminded of a saying, why keep shooting the messenger unless you are afraid of the message? I was reminded during the week of an anticipated 5-week trial that was scheduled to commence in Australia last week. The case is about a woman, Ms. Karen Ristevsky, who disappeared from her home and was discovered deceased a long time later in a wooded area a significant distance from the home. Karen's husband, Boris Ristevsky, was under suspicion of committing the murder from the commencement of the investigation, but he maintained his innocence, fiercely at times. Karen and Boris have a daughter who's in her early 20s, and she stood by her father through media interviews. She claimed that the investigators had tunnel vision with respect to her father's involvement in the murder of her mother. There was, as far as has been made public, no real direct evidence other than a grainy CCTV shot. And similar to this case, interestingly, there was evidence from some family members that the marriage was very good. On the eve of the trial, the day before the matter was due to commence, Mr. Ristevsky surprised many by pleading guilty to the murder of his wife. Now, of course, that case has absolutely no specific implications with respect to this case, but my point is, and is one made by so many others, just because someone says something 1,000 times doesn't make it fact. Just because very close family members stand by the accused, in that case, the daughter of the accused and also the daughter of the victim, doesn't mean they are innocent. Just because some family friends offer up evidence that it was a happy and almost perfect marriage doesn't mean it was. And just because law enforcement focus on someone initially and then take a considerable amount of time to charge them with the crime doesn't necessarily mean the person is innocent, or that the investigation was not thorough, or that prosecutors believed that person was actually innocent. Now, what I'm going to do now is highlight some other elements of the forensic examination and talk a little bit more about what those logins could mean. We'll look at some of the different possible scenarios that could explain them. But before I do that, I wanted to quickly address the claims by a small group of people that this information about the logins, the fact that they require a person to be physically interacting with the machine, is somehow all made up by me, and that I'm putting words in Mr. Devlin's mouth. I'll be very clear in saying I am not. Those that know me know that I'm very careful with my choice of words, and that I wouldn't make the statements I have made without absolute confidence in their accuracy. I'll say this, and I don't think it can be much clearer. I have 100% confidence that neither Mr. Devlin or other digital forensic specialists would attribute those 2 login entries on the Red Gateway laptop, being the failed password attempt and the last successful login, to anything other than someone physically interacting with the laptop at the time of those entries. Now, how could I prove that point? Well, the reality is I couldn't. If I offered up 100 digital forensic specialists giving this opinion, people will claim that there is a 101st specialist who might say differently, or that I've somehow picked out 100 specialists who are all going to say what I believe. If I said that I'd been in contact with Mr. Devlin regarding these events, I would be asked for proof. If I provided proof, it would be suggested the proof was doctored in some way. The bigger question that those who continue to doubt the importance of the logins need to ask themselves is, why are you continuing to dispute the evidence? Actually, it's mostly just disputing me, but rather than considering that evidence as accurate and working with that to determine the truth, ask yourself why that is not of any interest to you. As you know, Mr. Devlin produced a report based on his forensic examination of those computers, and there's some talking points from the report conducted on the 3 computers, the Dell desktop, the HP laptop, and the Gateway laptop. The forensic examination involved selecting searches of various applications and categories of items. The results of that search are split by device, and I'll highlight some that may be interesting. Now first, starting with the HP laptop, and that was the laptop that was used just before the Melgars went out to dinner. Now that laptop has 48 items relating to dating site URLs. The URLs are a web address, so 48 items relating to dating site websites. It has 7 items relating to web chat websites, and it has 16 items relating to pornography websites. It has 2,676 items relating to an in-private browser. Some of you may know you can select a private mode on particular browsers. It also has one item relating to encryption or anti-forensic tools. There are 30 items relating to Craigslist ads, and there's 3,676 items relating to classified websites. Now, the Gateway laptop. It had 55 items relating to dating websites. It had 4,894 classified website URLs. It had 5,919 in-private browser URLs. It had 2 encryption or anti-forensic tools installed on it. There were 101 Skype contacts. And it had 3 items relating to Craigslist ads. Now, onto the desktop. It had 5 items relating to web chat websites. It had 15 items relating to pornography websites. It had 43 items relating to dating sites. It had 2,282 items relating to classifieds websites. It had 1 encryption or anti-forensic tool. And it had 4 items relating to Craigslist ads. So, what do all of those points mean? Well, I encourage you to have a look through the forensic report and join in discussions on our Facebook page. They are likely not at all nefarious, but they absolutely give an insight into life inside the Melgar home. Now, in relation to the logins, there are 3 possible scenarios to explain the login attempts on the Red Gateway laptop with the Sandy user login. Those 3 are, we have an intruder logging in, we have Jim logging in, or we have Sandra logging in. The scenario I discussed last week, that a state-sponsored group installed a program to mimic a login that actually got that login wrong and then apparently achieved nothing, is beyond mild speculation. It's about as far-fetched as you can possibly get, so we'll leave that scenario out of our considerations. So, in considering the first possible scenario, an intruder in front of the laptop logging in as Sandra into the Sandy user account, first, think about why they would choose that particular laptop. There's a desktop PC there in the study, and personally, I'd actually choose that desktop device to log into to find any meaningful data if that was my purpose. But for the purpose of this scenario, let's assume this intruder believed that something worthy of investigation was specifically on the Red Gateway laptop. First, that requires the Red laptop to be out and available. Remember, it was the HP laptop that was in use just before Jim and Sandra went out to dinner, and that laptop was found closed in a bag. So, either the Red laptop was still on display for some reason, or it was in the bag also, and they decided to get it out of the bag to try and log in. So these intruders open up the laptop and are presented with a password request. They enter a password, maybe just 1234 or the letters spelling out password, because presumably they didn't know the password, so they might have just entered anything, and they get it wrong. So what do? They don't then try the other laptop or the desktop computer. They either then get the password right, or they go away and try again 35 minutes later. Now that's interesting. If they had the time and the patience to try and log on to a laptop, wouldn't they have the time to switch on the desktop and try that, or get out the other laptop and try that? In the second scenario, it was Jim that logged into the laptop. Now, how does that fit with the narrative given by Sandra? Well, Sandra did indicate that Jim left the jacuzzi to get ice at one point during the 2-hour jacuzzi. And then we have Sandra's suggestion that Jim left the jacuzzi to get the dogs, and that was the last time she saw him. At least, her last memory of seeing him. Now, as I indicated last week, the door to the study and a significant portion of the room can be seen from the jacuzzi. It would have required Sandra to turn her head to the right to see that though, so it is possible that she didn't look for Jim in the study on his supposed trip to get the ice, but assuming she had been waiting up to 20 minutes for Jim to return when he supposedly went to collect the dogs, surely she would turn her head to see, or at least call out. The study, if that was where Jim was close by. And would Jim have needed his glasses to use the laptop, and then would he have had those glasses with him in the jacuzzi? Or would it have required him to grab them from his bedside table if that is where they were kept? I can't see it being likely that Jim would have had his glasses on whilst in the jacuzzi, and if he did require them to use the laptop, would it be likely that he would have made a detour from grabbing ice if it required also grabbing his glasses and then perhaps putting those same glasses back on the nightstand before returning to the jacuzzi? Why would Jim have used the red Gateway laptop rather than the desktop or the HP laptop with his user account? And then, why would he have packed the laptop away after using it if, as Sandra describes it, they were having romantic discussions in the jacuzzi and then, after the jacuzzi, were going to continue to have a romantic time in bed? So as you can tell, there are a lot of lingering questions and potential problems with this computer activity being attributed to Jim. The answers to many of those lingering questions will provide some pretty important answers. And last, that brings us to the scenario of Sandra logging onto the laptop. Now, how does that fit with the narrative that we have been given by Sandra? Well, it's been offered by some that Sandra may have simply exited the jacuzzi to check email or similar a number of times during the 2-hour jacuzzi. It's been offered up in support of this scenario that Sandra may simply have forgotten about the trips to the study to use the computer, as they didn't seem meaningful or important to raise, or she may have forgotten because her memory of those trips was missing from that night. And whilst I think that is obviously possible, it does raise some further questions about Sandra's narrative of events that evening. I think this is an area that Sandra herself could probably provide some insight on, and an area where, if Bob was truly interested in undertaking a comprehensive investigation, he would be able to ask Sandra some questions on. And what would these questions be? Well, first, it would be interesting to know who normally used which computer. Was the fact that the different computers had different logins for both Jim and Sandra an indication that they would use the appropriate login for them? For example, if Sandra was logging on, would she use the Sandy account? Or if Jim was logging on, would he use the Jim account? Second, it would be interesting to know who was using the HP laptop prior to Jim and Sandra going out for dinner. This is the activity on that laptop at approximately 7:30 p.m. Now that's important because we know the HP laptop was found in a laptop bag along with the Gateway laptop, and accordingly, it must have been packed away at some point. An answer to that question also provides us with another indication of who used which laptops. Remember, the HP laptop didn't require a password or to specifically select a user account to log on. Third, would the laptops normally be kept on the desk in the study when in use? Remember, we've seen the large space in front of the monitor when almost every other space in the study is covered with paperwork. Now, I can think of many more questions, but for now, I think the answers to the above would provide us with some important information to understand the nature of the computer use and to further determine the likely sequence of events that evening. But it remains to be seen whether those questions will be asked of Sandra, and if those questions are asked, will we receive answers to them? And we will leave it there for this week. If you haven't already, I encourage you to continue the discussions on these matters on our Facebook page. The link is available through our website or search on Facebook for Truth is Justice. And we look forward to you joining us next week as we continue to set the record straight.